addiction, prevention, recovery.
Welcome to the Recovery Rebirth Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Recovery Rebirth Podcast. I'm Dominic.
And I'm Jillian.
And Jillian, I have a question for you. What triggers you?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe after a long, exhausting day, the recording equipment acting up when we're trying to record a podcast. Other than that, I can't think of anything.
Yeah, I had to switch recorders. We were trying to record one way, and we have to record another way. But we're here with you. Welcome, audience. So if you haven't guessed already, we're talking about triggers. So typically triggers are thought about in, addiction and that it's going to make you drink or it's going to make you use drugs or, do that sort of thing. But actually there's a whole psychological profile that's associated with triggers, and it's not just addiction. I mean, it can trigger PTSD or it can trigger emotional responses, basically an unexpected emotional response. Some sort of sensory stimulus that kicks in the fight or flight mode. And I know when I think of triggers as a person with substance use disorder, I usually just think, well, that's going to make you drink or make you do drugs. But, I've had fear triggers in my life, too.
Yeah.
So that set me off, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I want to hear what you have to say about triggers in your life, being a person who doesn't have substance use disorder.
I do not. As anybody who's listened for a little while or heard a few of our episodes, my stuff is all focused on relational stuff, I guess, as it called like process addiction. So I struggled with codependency, people pleasing, and all the related behaviors and love addiction kind of stuff. So what's has triggered me a lot throughout my life is, and it's connected to this core abandonment fear because of my relationship with my mom when I was a kid. I've dated a few people that have cheated on me. And being betrayed or cheated on or feeling rejection, whichever.
Rejection.
Feeling rejected or rejection, is it really, really triggers me. And I do go into that kind of fight flight. There's also fawn or freeze. Freeze or I guess freeze. Fawn is the newest one. I tend to be I freeze sometimes, and then fawn is kind of like the people pleasing response. But I have, felt all of these, but where I just get this visceral, and it's hard to describe. And, when I'm triggered, I don't necessarily turn to my drug of choice, which is, a dysfunctional man. And sometimes I do, or I just get, it causes depression, anxiety, those kinds of things.
Sure.
Come up for me when I'm triggered by, those experiences of having somebody betray, abandon, reject, or, feeling like I'm being abandoned is a huge one for me. What kind of things trigger you?
Well, I talked about fear a second ago, and it took me a while in recovery, getting past the substance use part where I have no desire to use alcohol or drugs. The fear of financial insecurity. And I figured out that came from my childhood because my mother was a single mom. She worried about money all the time, trying to take care of me and feed me and, run a household. And she was an old-fashioned Italian mom, so she didn't have a concept of going to work or whatever. She didn't really have a career. Her job was to take care of me. So, she had a lot of fear about money, and that passed along to me. It was like generational pass along there.
Right.
And my father, who was a workaholic, gave himself a heart condition. He was always concerned about money, too. He wanted to make more money. And he did have a career, and he just worked harder and harder until finally, he had a heart attack. And I realized that was setting off like some sort of PTSD trigger in me in adulthood when things are fine. Like all the bills are paid, there's money in the bank, bills are paid, more money's coming, but I'm fearful that I'm going to go broke. And I see that as a trigger, and it's a serious one because you get frozen, and I have to think to myself, wait a minute, you paid your bills for this month, you got your bills paid for next month.
Right.
Why are you freezing up and feeling scared or whatever? So that was a big one for me to figure out with a trigger. So it didn't make me want to drink, but it sure froze me up in fear.
Right. And we have definitely, we've talked about that throughout our podcast about how, because I think it's when we did a little series on trauma, and we talked about that, and that was for you one of your traumas, and both of our triggers are rooted in our childhood fears, like my fear of abandonment, your fear of scarcity around money. And so anything that feels like it could, it doesn't even have to actually be happening, but just the thought of like it could happen is enough. And something that I had to tell myself when after my ex-fiance, after he cheated on me, I was so crestfallen. Like I can't even tell you the depth of emotional agony. It was bad. And I had to tell myself, I had this little mantra that helped get me through, and I would say, it's not happening now. Because I would just get so triggered. In fact, this past weekend, I saw the other woman who was part of that situation. And so I've talked about it in other podcasts. I got a call from her New Year's Eve 2014. And it was so jarring for me that I was physically ill. I threw up within 30 minutes, and I was sober. It wasn't from alcohol, but it was just such a strong emotional response. And for probably 3 years, it didn't help that I kept trying to work things out with him. Like I tried reconciling. So seeing her was a trigger for me for a very long time. And I would creep her social media profile and try to figure out what she had that I did. It was very unhealthy. But I saw her this past weekend when I was out for breakfast with my dad and my son and his girlfriend. And I remember whispering to my son's girlfriend, I'm like, hey, the lady that my ex cheated on me is here. And she's like, and I'm like, but it's been like 8.5 years now. And I have emotional neutrality now, which is nice because there was a time that seeing her would make my heart race. I'd feel anxious. She was a huge human trigger, and so have been many of my exes. But it just felt really good, and that is a testament to recovery because I've worked through, that betrayal and plenty of other things. And I remember my sponsor telling me when I was in the midst of that, just excruciating heartbreak, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, was pulling over the side of the road because I was crying so hard I thought I was going to pass out. And she just kept, assuring me that it wasn't going to hurt forever. And lo and behold, it took a while, but I did get to the emotional neutrality, which is nice.
So you were able to identify your trigger and then work through it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm doing with the fear thing.
Yeah. So what do you do when you feel that come up around money, even though logically, because when you're in that fight or flight, your amygdala's activated. So what do you do to kind of rationalize with yourself that this fear is unfounded at the moment?
Well, I have to first ground myself in the moment where I'm at. Mm-hmm. So that would be the first thing I do because of course you feel helpless and out of control when you're triggered.
Yep.
That would be part of the response is feeling helpless or out of control. Mm-hmm. And or a situation you can't control, which for a lot of people in recovery, whether it's people, places, things, alcohol, drug, whatever, we have control issues. We want to control the situation as best we can.
Yes.
So when you feel this helpless loss of control, you get scared.
Spiral.
So I have to get grounded in the moment for me. I have to remember, ask myself some questions. So I ask myself, are the bills paid? Yup. Do you have enough money in the bank to pay the next set of bills? Yup. Are you going to make more money to pay the next set and the next set? More than likely. Mm-hmm. So I have to just go through that set of questions and get myself out of it that way, as opposed to years ago when I would have said, this is a good excuse to drink. I don't want to feel this way.
Right.
So that would be what I would do is identify and work through in grounding myself in the moment, because that's the serenity prayer helps a lot.
Yes, it does.
I use that one. grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change.
Mm-hmm.
But the important part of this one for triggers is the things I can change.
Courage to change the things I can.
Correct.
Yes.
So
yes.
Is there something I need to be doing?
Mm-hmm.
Is there some action I need to be taking? And most of the time when I'm triggered like that with fear, there's no action that I should be taking. As a matter of fact, what I need to do is take a step back and realize that there's nothing that needs to be done. You're doing everything you're supposed to be doing, and it's going to be fine.
Yeah.
At least for that trigger, for the fear thing, that way.
Now, what other triggers? Because I know when we started recording before, we were kind of going over some of the common triggers that people have, sort of just, And I know that I touched on one of them, like abandonment, or a couple of them, abandonment and rejection, I think were two, and maybe even betrayal. And those are kind of, whether or not people are in recovery, those can be some universal triggers.
Yeah, I had rejection and unworthiness triggers go off with relationship.
Yeah.
Because, at least for me, with my parents dying, I felt abandonment.
Yeah.
So you had different abandonment, but it's still abandonment.
It all hurts the same.
It does all hurt the same. So I think I struggled a lot in my younger years with allowing myself to truly love someone or fall in love with a significant other, because everything I love leaves me is the mantra that I was running through my head, and that's a trigger right there for abandonment.
Yes.
So thinking somebody's going to leave before the indication of leaving ever even occurs is over the top trigger.
It is.
And then you start to feel that abandonment, and you feel rejection because you're setting yourself up for it. And feeling unwanted, or, well, I don't know if I felt unwanted, because I was in some what could have been healthy relationships, but my brain space wasn't in healthy mode.
Right.
So in other words, I had a good partner who was understanding, but I couldn't get over the commitment fear, because everything I love is going to leave me, so why should I get myself into this and cause the pain? So let's just cause a bunch of pain in between.
I can relate to that. Well, I know we were talking earlier too, with before the recording went afoul.
Went sideways.
Before it went sideways. But things like, sounds and smells, I know, so memories, for me, like the sense of smell is most closely tied. It's hardwired into our brain. And one of the things I had to purge from my life a handful of months ago, I gave my daughter this body spray that I had that I really liked, but it kept reminding me of my qualifier for my SLAA program in my acting out days with him. And so I would just have these flashbacks to being over there hanging out with him. I'm like, I need to not have this around. As much as I like the smell of this fragrance, it's triggering me.
Right.
Avoiding certain places that would remind me of my ex, certain songs. If I would see a car that reminded me of my ex's car. So those kinds of things. Do you have, what other kind of things do you have that you can think of that were triggers for you?
Well, I also am triggered by certain songs, reminds me of people or times and places and stuff like that. What we're talking about now is actually defined as a signal type of trigger. So it acts like a reminder of what happened in the past. Because we talked about the anger part, right?
Yeah.
So that's a spark trigger. It motivates you to act.
Yeah.
And then a signal trigger, though, is a reminder type of thing. And then you've got a facilitator type trigger, which operates with dealing with trauma. So, something triggers a trauma from the past. So there's all these different kinds of triggers. And I had no clue there were so many different kinds. I mean, I used to buy into that joke that, breathing was the trigger. But what triggers me, a lot of times is I'll be watching a movie, let's say, and I have no desire to do cocaine anymore. However, if I watch a movie with somebody doing a massive amount of cocaine, I actually could get like a twitch
Yeah.
Not like a craving.
Right.
I don't know how to describe it, but I'll just get a twitch like I know what that feels like. I remember that.
Yeah.
And, of course, I was doing that drug so I could drink more.
Right.
But I don't get triggered when I see people drinking alcohol.
Interesting.
So it's really strange. I mean, do you have things like that happen to you?
Well, now that you mention movies, I do have, like, if I watch movies where somebody's being cheated on, because, that was one of the darkest, most painful chapters of my life when my ex cheated, because it was the only thing, it was on par with the feelings of abandonment from my childhood. Like, I don't ever want to feel that kind of pain again. So currently where I'm at is just avoiding. Like, I haven't dated in 2 years. I'm avoiding altogether, because my solution has become, just don't let anyone get close to you. And that's a different episode. And, then you can't be hurt. But what if I see a movie, like there's a scene in Love Actually, which I love that movie. I have a tradition of watching it every year by myself, drinking Chardonnay and crying. And it's usually like a half a glass of Chardonnay, because I don't really like to drink very much.
I don't get a half a glass of anything. What are you talking about, a half a glass?
I'm just like, it makes me sleepy. So they'll usually be like a half a glass of wine the next morning sitting there when I'm done. But there's a scene where Emma Thompson's character finds out that her husband's having an affair. Like, maybe it's an emotional affair, she's not sure, but that is just such a gut-wrenching scene, and I unfortunately relate to it really hard. Or any other movie where there's a betrayal or somebody's being cheated on. Also, I don't and trigger warning, listeners, as a survivor of sexual assault, if I see a scene in a movie where there's a sexual assault, like, that can be triggering for me too.
It's amazing how there's so many different variations of it, like visual versus sound versus, thought triggers are usually what I think of first. A thought comes to mind that I'm worried about something. What do you do to help your triggers, though? If you're triggered like that and you find yourself crying in a half of a glass of Chardonnay, what do you do to change the vibe or get out of it and break the cycle, so you don't keep like beating yourself down like that as some sort of masochistic behavior? Yeah. I'm just going to watch this scene over and over again and cry.
I have been known to milk a really good, like, I used to be addicted to melancholy when I was a kid. Like, just listen to some, just Cure on repeat and just cry myself to sleep listening to pictures of you. It was so ridiculous, because my cheating ex-boyfriend had, he was my boyfriend at the time, had like bailed on me again. Anyhow, I can always turn the movie off. I got rid of the spray that reminded me of the other guy of my qualifier. I can interrupt that and again, and thankfully I haven't been super triggered in quite a while. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen again. But, not subjecting myself to the thing that's triggering me is always one way to interrupt that.
Sure.
And if I find myself in a very overwhelming situation again, where like my amygdala is flooded, or I'm just, in one of those states of a trauma response, that little mantra that I came up with so many years ago that helped me, that it's not happening now. That's something else I could use again. I could just, keep that in my back pocket.
Well, that's one of the things the psychologist will mention is it's not happening now kind of thing, is to take a side, take a beat, take a breath, just, pause for a moment, make a shift.
Yeah, I had to, and I think you know this, but I witnessed my sweet son have his first, and I want to say, I hope it's his only, but who knows, odds are probably not. He had a panic attack, and this is not a person who struggles with anxiety really, but he had a full-on panic attack a couple weeks ago, because he went from loving his brand new job to feeling he felt dread. He's a pretty hardcore introvert and took a job working in a call center, not realizing until he experienced it that talking on the phone to people all day long was just a terrible fit for him. And the thought of having to do that any longer, I told him he had to give us 2 weeks notice. He had a panic attack, and I had to grab him by the hands and force him to look at me and just tell him, breathe. I'm like, you're home. You're safe. I had to tell him, you are not at work.
So you were able to help him work through it.
I was able to like talk him down. And in the end, the thing that really worked was recovery language is like, buddy, just take it one day at a time. Take it one phone call at a time. Because I'm like, sometimes you need to do it one moment at a time. And that was the thing that finally clicked. I'm like, and when you're not there, just be present with where you're at now. Like when you're home, be home. And it was interesting. And it was heartbreaking to see him go through that. Because he's never been an anxious person. But I helped to get him grounded because What
do you think triggered him to have a panic attack about a job? I mean, he's young, he's bright, he's got all the potential in the world.
Yeah.
But he's fearful about this job. It's like, I don't like it, I'll leave.
Yeah. He was the thought of having to do 2 more weeks of that, just like it triggered a panic attack for him. I'm like, oh my gosh. And he talked to his supervisor, and she was like, she tried to find him another position, and they didn't have anything open at the time, but she's like, yeah, I don't think you're going to be able to do 2 more weeks. I think you should just submit your resignation letter. And she was very supportive, but that was brutal watching him go through that. But I was able to, kind of help get him grounded and just like, you're not there.
But what do you think triggered him to have a panic attack about a job? Well, it's his first job, right?
It's his first grown-up job. Like he worked, at Jimmy John's before them. So this was like his first, adult, like professional job.
So he was having a lot of fear of failure and
possibly. We haven't really talked it all out, but yeah. So he just,
because that's one of the things that the psychologists will talk about
fear
is
of failure.
working through your triggers and trying to get to the root.
Yes. Yeah.
So like journaling about it or writing about it and trying to, as thoughts come to mind, because I know for me, I had to work through my fears with a pen and paper.
Yeah.
I had to start writing down, like, why am I really fearful of this? I mean, I'm capable, I'm able. Why am I so worried? And worry is crippling. I mean, you can take success and yank out the piece of wood like the whole Jenga thing comes down.
Yes,
you know what I mean? Just by exercising fear and worry for no reason.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, this is going to sound kind of silly to people not in recovery, but observing my son go through that, I was telling him, I'm like, he hasn't really had many challenges and definitely no adversity in his life. So I guess because thanks to my childhood trauma and subsequent adult trauma, like I have some coping mechanisms. And I was like, buddy, you gotta find some coping mechanisms.
Develop some coping mechanisms.
Hopefully not maladaptive ones, like some good healthy ones. But he hasn't really had a need to, because he hasn't really faced many challenges or adversity. And so in a weird way, I was like, look at the bevy of coping mechanisms I have thanks to my traumas.
Well, maybe somehow I don't mean to knock your parenting, because I know you're a great parent to your son and your daughter, but maybe you protected him too much, and
I don't know.
And because you didn't want him to go through what you went through, so you were, there, and then he's on his own now. He's, the bird has flown out of the cage, and
we're getting there. Yeah.
So, perhaps that was something that triggered him, because this is his first job on his own.
Yeah. I think he's had just too much consistent love and support.
There you go, man. What you need to do is yank that right out from underneath him. Stop loving him so much.
It's not just me that's done it. It's his dad and other people. But
no, I get that.
But it is, it was interesting. Just we've had very different paths. There's a quote that before, I'm not sure where we're at, because folks, we do try to keep our podcast to about 30 minutes to keep it, digestible. But there's a quote that I got possibly from some other podcast, or maybe even Recovery, but triggers are our teachers. So that might seem Pollyanna to some people, but that is one way I've learned to look at them as teachers. And that's not to make light of it, because they are, it can be really scary. I've been there. I've been panicked, and I've been feeling like, the rug was pulled out from under me, and I felt like I was free falling emotionally before. But when we're in this, fight, flight, fawn, freeze state, it's the PTSD, true PTSD, and betrayal can be a form of PTSD, because I'm telling you, when I went through that experience with my ex-fiance cheating on me, I got super, super triggered, and I would like viscerally feel that, because with trauma, you're not, and with PTSD, it's like you're actually reliving it. You're not just having the memory of the experience.
Correct. Your entire body and experience is going through that. And
all over again.
There's actually Dr. Joe Dispenza.
Yeah, I know that name.
He talks about the fact that all of our actions are based on memories. Like we don't live in the present or the future. We're constantly reliving the past.
Huh.
So this is an interesting concept with triggers, because when you wake up in the morning and you do your usual routine, let's say you get up, you go to the bathroom, you walk to the coffee maker, you go check your computer and email or whatever, you check your Instagram, I don't know, whatever you're doing in the morning, you do those routines. But your brain is programmed, anyone's brain is programmed to operate on memories. So if you want to make change, you really need to break the whole mold of memories and get yourself in the future. Project where you want to be instead of where you're at, because the brain defaults to where you've been. And that's some interesting study to get rid of some triggers, because if I'm looking to the future, I've got, bright things on the horizon. But when I kick in the fear mode or any other trigger, I'm going to a past memory.
Yeah.
So dealing with, and that's where journaling, I think, helps to get the past memories out on paper so you can recognize them. Because if you want to change anything, like even they talk about implicit bias and racism and all that, and I do a talk on implicit bias as it relates to addiction, because it's all based on memories created from what we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
So one of the ways, if you want to try to break your triggers, to stop them from triggering you, is to create new visions of the future. How do I want to be?
Okay.
That's another one that I hear from a motivational speaker I like, Brendan Burchard. He always talks about, like, before you go into a meeting, think for a brief moment, meditate for even 2 minutes, and think about, how do I want to be? How do I want to be perceived? How do I want to act in this meeting for this particular purpose? If you're somebody that runs a very busy schedule, running from one thing to the next, we don't often take a beat.
Yeah.
And we get triggered all the time because our brain is filled with memories. It's a hard drive.
Yeah.
So if we're operating from past memory, we're going to screw up at the same time. We're going to mess up the relationship at the same part of it. We're going to do all the same things over and over again. So, Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about that and trying to break that, to get a vision, take a moment. And he talks a lot about meditation.
Okay.
So you meditate. And you meditate with a vision for the future, how you see yourself. How will you feel? How will you look? How will you smell? How will this happen so that you don't do it again? And it's a lot of work, but it's self-help work that's necessary if we want to get past it.
Well, it's like, almost to me, it seems like trying to help rewire those neural pathways, just to rewire your brain to have a different outcome. And as much as, it feels a little counterintuitive because we talk about being present in recovery a lot, right? But for this specific issue, this is a good time to be a little future focused, because you're thinking of what you want to manifest.
Correct.
Versus always drawing on those painful memories that trigger you and just keep you stuck in that vicious loop and playing those old tapes. So this is one time, listeners, that it's okay to be more future focused.
Well, I think being future focused is important, with the outcomes being left up to the higher power or whatever. But I've lived in the past because I've allowed my fears to drive me in a lot of ways.
Right.
And I'm getting over it slowly. It's a process, people. It doesn't happen overnight. We all have fears. We all have anxieties. We all have PTSD in one form or another. I don't know a human being that hasn't been through some type of trauma. Yeah. We've all been through some type of trauma. You can't live for more than 10 minutes and have a trauma. I was sort of almost half stung by a bee when I was a kid. probably a kid about, maybe I was 4 years old, and a bee landed on my hand, and I freaked out. You know, it was trying to sting me. It didn't actually sting me. But I like shook my hand, freaked out. So now I have a phobia of bees for my entire life.
Really?
Now those nasty yellow jacket things that come out in the summer, I don't like them, and they don't like anybody.
Yeah.
Though I'm not talking that, you know, where you're getting attacked. You know, you're sitting there at a picnic, and all of a sudden you've got 2 or 3 of these things flying around your face. But I've had a fear of bees just being in the same area.
Interesting. Because I don't know if I stepped on an underground bee's nest when I was 5.
Oh boy, that'll do
it. I got stung from head to toe.
Good heavens, are you terrified of bees?
Ironically, no. Like, oddly, no. I mean, you would think, but
now if I'm out and there's, you know, something flying around in the vicinity, I don't have the palpitations in my heart like I used to as badly, you know, because most of the time, unless it's those nasty yellow and black yellow jacket picnic garbage smelling bees that come around, those things are just
aggressive.
Plain nasty.
They are very aggressive.
But other than those, most of the time these things just want to fly around and do their thing. They're trying to, you know,
they want to pollinate.
They want to eat lunch.
They want to pollinate and help our food supply.
So, well, regular bees, they're actually kind of nice, you know, honeybees and bees that are, you know, pollinating plants, but there's you know, the wasps and the hornets and all those guys.
So I saw a funny meme once that shows like the different kind of, you know, stinging insects like bees and most of them are pollinators, but it shows like what they do, and one of them, I think it was a wasp, and it says just an a-hole, because they don't pollinate, all they do is sting you, and
their whole job is to annoy people.
Right.
But the point in bringing that story up is that the PTSD from having that, like watching it almost try to get me.
As a very young child.
Stuck
with you for years.
Stuck with me for many, many years. So we can, as human beings, work through the various triggers that affect us. And journaling, meditation, taking breaks, getting it out. It's all important stuff toward working for a better future, rather than allowing the hard drive of memory to drive us into the same routine that we've always been in. And if that routine ain't working for you, I used to have a buddy in recovery that would ask this question. Somebody would rattle off some massive story about, well, then this happened, and then she said this, or that happened, or whatever the thing they got going on, or then my boss said... And it's like, how's that working for you? That was what he'd always say. He'd listen to this diatribe of a conversation, one-sided conversation, and then he'd say, how's that working for you? And it would be like a pregnant pause. And most of the time, it'd be like, well, it's not working. Well, do something different.
Right.
So I'm sure we're going to have some resources to look up.
I will see what I can find. I'm wondering if, I know this is a thing, but I don't know if it's advisable in this exposure therapy. I don't know how that works for triggers. I know it's a thing.
I know it wouldn't have worked for me and bees.
Just being put
I did not want to be around a bee. I still don't really like to be around them.
I mean, but
I don't freak out and have the palpitations. I mean, you have to jump out of my skin just looking at one.
Yeah.
And it's tough because I love nature. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm out there hiking and walking and hanging out camping and all that fun nature stuff that I love to do.
Yes.
But I used to freak out and do, you know, jumping and rolling and getting out of the way when there was a bee anywhere nearby. And most of the time they would just, you know, being about their bee business.
They're just on their way looking for pollen or source of food.
So, Get into meditation is one of the things I'd recommend, because I've done some visualizations of where I want to be and where I want to go, and I feel better. And I've tried to break my routines by being conscious of them, so that when you do the same thing, like going to the coffee maker, going to do this, all of that, what your brain just starts opening up the hard drive and going back to the past.
Yeah.
That's all it has to work with. The future ain't happening yet, right?
Yeah, exactly. The future can't trigger you.
So, thanks for listening. Thanks for good conversation on triggers.
Now that we got through the trigger of the recording after the initial recording not working.
But I'm fine. My heart is not beating fast. I'll figure it out. We'll get that fixed. And anyway, this was recorded today for you listeners on the Recovery Rebirth Podcast. Thank you. Hey, people need to share this on social media too. If you like this podcast, we've got listeners now like in multiple countries. We're doing
international
good.
Folks.
We are international now, and new countries are being added and stuff. But how about right here in the old U.S. to use that Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, whatever, share, like. Do the stuff, help us out.
All those fun
Subscribe.
Things. Yeah.
We even have a donate button if somebody wants to donate to the cause.
And we will not be triggered, listeners. It'll have actually a very calming effect on us if you donate.
Oh, thanks for being here, Jillian.
Thank you, Dom. And thank you so much, listeners.
Take care.